go ahead and call the meeting to order.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Here.
Commissioner Hatch?
Here.
Commissioner Hayward?
Here.
Chair Matich?
Here. Good morning. I want to begin with two quick announcements. First is that, as you may have noticed on our website, we are now piloting the new digital public participation project that we approved last month. So I want to remind the public that you can go to the FPPC's website and submit comments on our agenda items in real time, simply by going to our website and clicking the link. So I hope folks take advantage of that. I also wanted to acknowledge the work of our IT staff in making that possible. I think it was certainly beyond my expectation we'd be able to do this as quickly as we're able to do it. So I want to just acknowledge briefly Larry Crabtree, who's our Chief Information Officer, Jesse Hidalgo, who's our Information Technology Specialist, Rieko Ivaska, an Information Technology Specialist, and Elwin Yabut, who's our Information Technology Tech. So, and of course there were others as well, but I definitely want to acknowledge our IT staff for their great work. I also wanted to highlight the fact that recently the Coalition for Integrity released a report recognizing the tremendous work of our enforcement division in particular. Our agency received the third highest score in the nation as ethics agencies, ranked against other ethics agencies in other states. And it pointed out that the FPPC issues fines for ethics violations at a higher rate than most other states. So again, I wanted to acknowledge the tremendous work of our staff, particularly the enforcement division under the leadership of Chief of Enforcement West. So good job, guys, and keep it up. With that, let us move to public comment for items not on the agenda. Do we have any folks in the audience which would like to provide public comment? Good morning. In the future, we'd appreciate if you would provide those handouts ahead of time so we can have time to consider them. Thank you.
So my name is Scott Vaughn. I live in Placer County. I'm from Granite Bay. And I come to you this morning, Chairperson Matich, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, to let you know in April, when you accepted this position, obviously, you noted that the Fair Political Practice Commission plays a vital role to help ensure the political process is a fair, transparent, and that the public must have the trust that the system is proudly serving the people by providing these services. The public can be assured every effort is being made to have their government be as open and as trustworthy as possible. Furthermore, the FPPC mission statement notes that it is a primary goal of your organization to promote the integrity of state and local government in California through fair, impartial interpretation and enforcement of political campaign, lobbying, and conflict of interest laws. You know all these things, so. I recently submitted a complaint to the FPPC regarding a blatant disregard of transparency guaranteed under the Political Reform Act and multiple violations of FPPC ordinances requiring public disclosure of personal financial conflicts of interest for my elected supervisor, Placer County District 4 Supervisor Kirk Euler. FPPC codes, I've included them attached, clearly identify disqualifying personal financial conflicts and go through a rigorous series of checks and balances to ensure that the public is provided with a clear and concise disclosure of financial gains by our elected officials. On July 9th and again on July 23rd, Supervisor Kirk Euler, who happens to be the chair of the board and therefore sets direction for the board, was temporarily absent, leaving the meeting 5 minutes prior to an agenda item and returning to closed session at the end of the meeting. He then abstained on the 23rd rather than disclose to the public that an ordinance was being presented and subsequently approved, including a 25-step pay increase amounting to 28% raise for his wife. The position is to be reviewed upon exit of the incumbent, leaving significantly more speculation about pension spiking since she will have completed 20 years of county service. More disturbing were the number of departments and individuals who were complicit in seeing that Supervisor Euler was not made to make his required disqualifying closure to the vote. Kate Simpson of Human Resources highlighted 2 positions receiving a 10 and 11% raises, but did not mention the 28% pay increase for the supervisor's wife. County Counsel Karen Schwab allowed Supervisor Euler to be temporarily absent rather than upholding her obligation to ensure the ordinance was clearly presented to the public. County CEO Todd Leopold surely would have been aware of a step and paying grade this significant, and the 4 members of the boards of the supervisors, Gore, Wygant, Holmes, and Gufston, sat in silence, aiding and abetting. My original complaint was dismissed as having insufficient evidence. Thankfully, it's been reopened. The case has been reopened and is currently under review. I'm here to ask that the commission uphold its statutory responsibility and provide the maximum penalty for this offense. Please explain what evidence is required besides the videos that are online that you could see. My supervisor gets up at item 13, leaves, the vice chair takes the gavel and says he'll be temporarily absent, returning 5 minutes later after the vote. The vote takes place after no mention of the raise of his wife, only the 10 and 11% that was discussed, not the 28%. And then he comes back in closed session. He did abstain from the consent calendar item, but did not disclose why in the following meeting. I ask you today to stand behind your vital role in enforcing public transparency and trust, as well as the rules and regulations that our tax dollars have been used to create. Please act now and regain the public's trust. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Bradley Cutler, and I'm here this morning inspired by your website headlines. Politics is a swamp, but California and Washington get high marks for their ethics enforcers. For the last couple of years, Scott Vaughn and myself have made an attempt to put transparency and honesty into the government of Placer County, but it failed, as was evidenced by Scott's complaint to address the numerous violations by the Placer County Board of Supervisors in voting to spike the salary of Supervisor Euler's wife. You rejected our complaint initially because there was a lack of evidence on the tape showing the chairman walking out of the boardroom meeting in order to dismiss the political discussions of his wife's 28% raise. There was no mention of the raise, nor discussion, so the person to receive the highest bonus of the many that were given was never disclosed publicly. So, in essence, a secret vote occurred so that Tammy and Supervisor Euler could sail off into retirement with a $500,000 annuity. Does this get high marks for enforcement? We appreciate your willingness to reopen the case and take a second look. Please recognize that this was not done in a vacuum. County Counsel Karen Schwab wasn't seen stepping in to correct the action of her chairman and took all the other supervisors, had their hands over their mouths, ears, and eyes like good kindergartners playing hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. This might be somehow plausible, but when questionable acts like this are repeatedly observed, it's just another day in Placer County. We have presented to the board of Placer numerous such incidents, and to put this violation into context, I'll just mention a few. Planning Commissioner Moss, Supervisor Euler's appointee, was the applicant for a multi-million-dollar commercial expansion in a residential zone. He was asked by the head of Placer County Community Service if this expansion was legal. The applicant was asked if it was legal by the head of enforcement. The same planning commissioner on the earlier phase of the same commercial project failed to correctly identify the parcels on which he was developing, so no one noticed that they were designated wetlands and where the commercial buildings were allowed. To this day, Placer County Tax Department hasn't fully accounted for all costs associated with that development, which has provided years of reduced taxes and no evidence that the open space and drainage land was developed for personal gain. That very same planning commissioner leveled 1.5 acres of wetlands to expand the project. County officials dismissed our objections by categorizing us as nosy neighbors. The California Department of Fish and Game, however, fined the commissioner hundreds of thousands of dollars in restitution, but that was a small price to pay for dodging CEQA and building in wetlands. There are more examples, but I think you get Placer's style: deaf, dumb, and blind. Don't be hoodwinked into Placer's newest installment of closed and silent government. This was done with eyes wide open by all involved as a generous parting gesture for somebody who continually grows Placer County. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comment on matters not on the agenda? Seeing no digital public comment, we'll move on to item number 2, approval of the August 2019 Commission hearing meeting minutes. Do any commissioners have any comments or corrections to the meeting minutes? Is there any public comment on the meeting minutes from August 2019? Hearing none, do we have a motion?
I move approval.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Move then to the consent calendar. Do any commissioners have any items on the consent calendar which they'd like to pull for a separate vote?
I don't want to pull one, but I have a comment on one of them.
All right,
Item 12, I think.
all right, hang on. Do any other commissioners have any items they want to pull?
Mr. Chair, if I may, item 3.
Item 3. All right. So we will consider item 3 separately from the others. Commissioner Hatch, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that in this particular matter, this is a charge for not providing the notice to potential major donor committees that they may have a filing obligation. This has been a sort of a frustrating thing over the years that often fairly large contributions are made, and the person making them doesn't know that they're triggering an obligation to register, and there is a provision in the law that requires the recipient committee to do something, notify them of that potential problem. And this one is about taking action against a recipient committee for not notifying, I think it was 30 potential contributors, and I just say, good job. Catch it at the front end instead of having to chase all these little individual ones. Thank you.
All right. Is there any additional commissioner comment on the consent calendar except for item number 3? Hearing none, is there any public comment on the consent calendar except for item number 3? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the consent calendar except for item number 3?
I'll move approval of the consent calendar items 4 through 18.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right. We'll then take up item 3 in the enforcement calendar. Commissioner Cardenas, did you have a comment or a concern?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This item number 3 is a proposed stipulation, decision, and order relating to a certain former member of the City of Commerce City Council. And what's been stipulated to is failure to timely file statements in 2013, but also failure to properly disclose certain financial activity in 2013 and 2014. The statement of facts details to some degree a rather amazing pattern of expenditures and disbursements with from the campaign, from the committee account. And there's a schedule here that was put together. I take it by the, what's her name, Ms. Leon? Is she the one? She is the former council member who is the subject of this.
She is, are you talking about the chart on
Yeah,
pages
the
8 and
chart
9?
on page 8.
That's a compilation of all the information we had gathered.
So all of these are what she purports to be expenditures made from funds drawn from her campaign committee account.
Correct.
Almost all of which, maybe all of which, appear to have no substantiating receipts. I guess my question is, what do we do in a situation where we have a record from bank statements of withdrawals from a campaign account, and we have no receipts for for these particular expenditures. All we have is the averment of the committee, the former councilwoman, that these various expenditures were for the purposes that she alleges. $200 from her campaign account for quote-unquote teacher recognition. $200 for a donation to a particular faith-based association. Another $500, these are nice even numbers, $500 for a quote-unquote charity. Another $300, charitable donation. I'm most particularly taken by by multiple withdrawals from the campaign account that she alleges were for Girl Scout supplies, Girl Scout cookies for firemen, Girl Scout raffle gift cards, and other purported Girl Scout contributions. And the statement of facts goes on to suggest that someone whose signature appears on some receipts, quote-unquote receipts, when contacted by your staff, denied that she signed what appeared to be her name on these receipts on behalf of the Girl Scouts. So why are we merely talking about a fine for failure to disclose? Why isn't there, is this not at least probative of possible outright fraud?
Good questions. Galena West, Chief of Enforcement. The Enforcement Division has the same frustrations that you're expressing with the law regarding political, legislative, or governmental purpose when determining proper use of campaign funds. So the standard has been written such that it's a loose standard of basically implication of use. And so we charge this based on what we can prove. And what we can prove is the $2,500 of personal use. So the part where we can track these down, we can track the person that supposedly signed it and show that that's not, she didn't authorize that or she didn't receive that contribution. We can track down National Pen and figure out that only one payment went to National Pen. And so we can easily have an assumption that the others did not, and the Nordstrom personal credit card. So we share the frustration of personal use and cash in campaigns. And in fact, at the November enforcement meeting, one of the things that we're going to discuss is strengthening the rules in order to allow for enforcement to be able to prosecute cash contributions with maybe some sort of presumption, if no receipts, then possibly a presumption of personal use, or try to get some help in this area in the law. But as you know, we don't write the law, so we can try to do it as a regulation, and perhaps that will fly. I don't know. I haven't discussed it with Mr. Bainbridge yet, but as you can see, our frustration with the law is real. So what we did is what we could prove, which is we could prove the non-disclosure on the campaign statements. We could prove the cash expenditures where cash came out in increments of above $100. And we charged the personal use that we could prove. So in cases like this, and we charged the one bank account to where that was something else that we could show movement of money in multiple accounts. So we got to give you the entire picture by what we could show and prove, but we do need to ask for help as we go to the November enforcement meeting on perhaps either the ledge calendar or the reg calendar, and use these cases as examples of what we need help working up and being able to prosecute more fully.
Commissioner Hatch, you have a comment?
Yes, Phil's working right now to try and seek input on legislative ideas for next session, or next year. So maybe this is something that we might want to toss to him and see if, unless you think it can be solved just by a regulation. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, it's something we'll have to research,
You
but
have to tell me, but you guys can figure it out.
I'm very much hoping it can be a regulation because obviously the people that would have to pass the legislation would be very affected by these rules, which makes it a little more difficult. Not that there aren't altruistic and good people that would try to strengthen the rules so that everyone would follow them.
Any further comment on item 3? Commissioner Cardenas?
Ms. West, thank you very much. What is our protocol and what is the threshold or the standard that we use when we determine whether a particular case is going to be referred for criminal prosecution? LA County has a public corruption unit. They may be overworked, but this may be something that they might want to take a look at. Somebody needs to take a look at this.
Right, and I mean, and the benefit is she's out of office, she's terminating her committee. The age of the violations, I'm not sure how much they would be interested, and they have a 4-year statute. But all these cases are referred, so we have a process in place that refers certain violations. And actually, I think everything on this list is on the referring for an automatic referral to the local DA.
You believe this case has been referred?
All cases that have these violations are referred.
This case has been referred.
Yes.
All right. You don't even have to feign righteous indignation on something like this. It's just self-evidently stinky. That, this is a portion of LA County that has suffered through public corruption for years, and there's got to be a stronger focus. We can only do so much. There are people whose jobs it is to help us restore public confidence in public officials.
And I would give a shout
Let us
out.
track what happens.
Okay.
What happens with this? I mean,
And then I would give a shout out to enforcement, because this wasn't based on a complaint. This was based on the investigation of 2 other candidates in that jurisdiction that we prosecuted both of those candidates. And so this came out of looking at those candidates, and then we said, well, we have to look at this candidate as well. And so we took the time, we spent the resources, and we did it. And that was all thanks to a great investigator and a great attorney that really spent the time. Because these aren't easy cases. These are generally unrepresented people who don't keep records. And so the challenge is uphill. And so the amount of time that these kind of cases take is great, but it has to be done. And obviously that'll be something that you decide at the November meeting as to how to spend resources. But I would make a pitch that these are definitely the cases that we want to spend the time on.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hatch?
These are essentially record keeping. In other words, the poorer the record keeping, the harder it is for you to prove anything, right? So they may have violated the law, but they lost the records, and so so maybe we need to put some teeth into the record keeping requirements. So violating a record keeping requirement in itself is a separate charge.
We generally charge record keeping. In this case, it was an aggravation of all counts, but we generally charge it a separate count. As just as a side note, as you can see with your agenda coming up, enforcement feels very strongly that record keeping is one of the most essential parts to enforcing the act. And so that's why we constantly try to push for stronger record keeping in all parts of the act.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. West. We appreciate that. And we certainly look forward, at least I look forward to, in November, having a fuller discussion about enforcement priorities. So I think at one time we can provide some direction on the policies we'd like to see implemented going forward. So with that, do we have a motion on item 3 then?
I so move.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Before we actually vote, is there any public comment on item 3, though? Hearing none. All right, Ms. Linker.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
I'm sorry. Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right. Moving on to item 19 in our agenda. This is the update to lobbying forms, and I believe we have our Deborah Hannepin, our Manager of Education Programs in the Legal Division. Good morning. Thank you. When did we receive the public comments?
Oh, sorry. The comments we received did not come in writing. They came kind of through one person who talked to one person, and they asked for some changes in the format.
Two comments, I guess, to begin with. Number one, just in general, just a reminder to stakeholders and other members of the public, it's very helpful to get your public comments in ahead of the commission meeting. The same day, it makes it very difficult for us to consider those comments in any meaningful way. So again, the agenda is published ahead of time. We'd appreciate those comments ahead of time if possible. Secondly, since we don't have the benefit of written comments, perhaps you can identify who submitted them and what the substance was.
Yeah. So there are 13 lobbying forms that we've updated at the request of Secretary of State. There's one form of campaign form, Form 402. The changes were all minor. They were made because the Secretary of State is asking that the updates be made to accommodate changes in the new CARS system. They want the changes to be effective when the system goes into effect. So they want these to be approved now so that the developers can put the changes into the system, and then when the system goes live, then these changes would be effective. The comments we received on Form 602 and 603 concern the format of attachment pages versus continuation pages. So they wanted the continuation pages and the attachment pages format to be the same throughout all of the documents. So it's nothing major. We made the changes Tuesday, we got them approved on Wednesday, and so here they are today with you all. There were no regulatory or statutory changes that were made, and so we're asking that you approve these changes, and I can answer any questions.
All right. Thank you very much. Do we have any commissioner comments or questions on item 19? Hearing none. Is there any public comment on item 19? All right. Do we have a motion on item 19?
I move for adoption.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Hanfin. All right, we're going to move to item 20. These are proposed rules for public participation at commission meetings. As a sort of a recap, we had this discussion last month, and we directed staff to come back to us with some proposed rules for that would govern how we do public participation, both here in person, as well as how we're going to be handling the digital public participation that we have. So we have Executive Director Jones to present on that, along with Commission Counsel Kevin Cornwell.
Thank you, Chair Matich. As the Commission knows, a wide variety of state agencies have in effect policies with respect to public participation. To date, the FPPC does not have formal policies in place because it's the stated mission of the agency to expand its breadth and invite more and more public participation, as is evidenced here. Staff thought it would be a good idea to provide the Commission with some suggestions as to how public participation can be handled in this new age. You'll note that the memo before you is heavily footnoted. We wanted to provide the Commission with how other agencies have dealt with this issue and how the law, where appropriate, has dealt with this issue. It's divided into 4 specific areas. There are proposed time-related rules, proposed organizational rules, proposed rules of order, and proposed rules that affect new technologies. As you might expect, the rules regarding new technologies are less heavily footnoted because we're entering into a world where very few, if any, state agencies have gone. I have Kevin Cornwall with me. He has thoroughly researched the law and is prepared to answer any questions, but if not, these are what staff regards as potential best practices for the commission to adopt.
Thank you, Executive Director Jones. I think this is, it's great work, and thank you very much for staff's work. Do we have commission comments on this?
I did. Good work, but maybe a couple of tweaks. Item 3 under the, what do you call it, the first group, under the time-related rules, I'm reticent to establish a standard that's 3 minutes, but I understand that that being the default may head off problems in the future. But so I would suggest that we change the language there in keeping with the 3-minute speaking time, that it's, instead of saying may be changed, we say extended, because I just don't see a reason why we would want to, reduce it to under 3 minutes. It's barely enough time to identify who you are and what before you get to the content of what your presentation is. Then also under item 8 would be a new item 8 that would say the commission may extend the time allotted any speaker either in advance or during the course of a speech. Procedurally, that would be something that any one of the commissioners would say, I move additional 3 minutes or whatever, and the chair would then rule on it. And if it actually became contentious, we could have a vote. And then under organizational rules, this is the final one, add a item 4, these could be someplace else, but an item 4 that would say, any speaker who wishes to use any audio-visual aids in their presentation must seek permission of the chair in advance. Do I need to repeat any of that, or you got it?
No, I got it all.
Okay, thank you.
Do we,
If I may have a brief response, just based on the, with respect to number 3 and the 3 minutes, the setting of the minutes in advance is usually, and the change by the chair is usually in anticipation the other way, that you have 50 commenters who show up, and 50 times 3 is 150 minutes that you're going to have to use for the meeting. Given that the commissioners travel to the meeting, you may enter a scenario that with the 3 minutes in advance, you have a meeting that extends more than one day. And this is exactly what has happened to one of the healthcare agencies, that they had to start trimming it down to 1 minute because they were getting so many people that they had to have multiple day meetings. So the 3 minutes and the change by the commission is actually with an eye towards if we show up today and there are 100 people who want to comment on a particular item, the chair has the capacity in bulk to narrow that down. I completely understand the desire, particularly in some knotty issues where there may be a need for extended comments, to be able to allow people to talk further. The risk of that is not procedural, which would obviously be up to the commission. There may, however, be legal risks with respect to the commission appearing to be not viewpoint neutral if they're allowing more time for a particular speaker, but not more time for another. But I'll let Commission Counsel Cornwall comment on that if you want to.
I mean, I think that pretty much sums up the reason that we would want to be able to change the amount of time, either extending it or shortening it there. there may be certain situations where it is necessary. And to do so would be legally permissible, given that the commission has the ability to regulate essentially the efficient conducting of a meeting and regulate the reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions.
Well, I get that, but just because it's legally permissible doesn't necessarily mean that it makes good sense. And some time ago, while I was still a young commissioner here, we had some very contentious times over a boatload of people that wanted to testify on one item. And we didn't have any rules in place, but the chair made a ruling, and didn't go down well with other commissioners. We ended up voting on it, and we asked them all to just please be careful of their time. And about 70 people lined up and went through this, and we got done in a couple hours because they were mindful of the problem, and so they curtailed it for themselves voluntarily. And I think most people would do that. I hate to put ourselves in a place where we're just not really giving the public any real attention. These people all come from a long ways. These guys this morning, I think, were someplace in Placer County. That means they had a pretty good drive to get here. And if we had held them to the 3 minutes, they probably wouldn't have got halfway through their presentations. And so, ergo, if you do have a 3-minute limit, somebody needs to be able to move for additional time if they'd like to hear the rest of it. I, quite frankly, I would welcome being sued for giving somebody additional time. Thank you.
Do we have other commission comments on this? Is there any public comment on the proposed rules for public participation?
Hi, Commissioners. Nicholas Hadorn with Common Cause. Just generally, I want to say I really like this experiment with the online system. I think it's going to be really neat to see. I really appreciated when the Commission visited other locations to hold your meetings, but one of the difficulties for smaller nonprofits is we don't have the budget to send someone to a city you go to, and obviously your staff that would comment, myself, are here in Sacramento. So I think this is a good way to maybe allow people who can't physically follow you if you go to a different location to comment. And one thought, maybe for the future, not this round, is if you do other off-site meetings, maybe by application, people could do an oral comment if they apply ahead of time in a similar way, if they have a PowerPoint, something like that. This seems very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, at this point, just to kind of frame this, we don't have a policy in place currently, and so I think this gets us a policy in place. I certainly agree with everything that's in this, and I'd be prepared to support it as is. And then as we move forward with this pilot program, it may suggest that experience dictates changes over time. And so perhaps we start with this policy, and then if the need arises, we can revisit this.
Well, if you want to do it that way, then I would ask that this be, that these suggestions be agendized for a future meeting. So we'll go ahead and adopt this. You want to do it?
Yeah.
Then I want this agendized.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
This is too important.
How does this sound? So move approval of.
And just to be clear, none of these are readily embraced. What
does that mean?
Well, I had 3 separate suggestions. Are they all a problem, or is it
And I apologize.
1 or 2?
The first 2 are the ones that are more at legal risk based on getting into the area where it appears to the public that the commission might be acting in a non-viewpoint neutral way. With respect to your 3rd suggestion, that any speaker who wishes to use audiovisual equipment must seek permission in advance from the chair. I know of no other similar policy, but with respect to the legal requirements, Commission Counsel Cornwall can address any legal issues that might arise from that.
given that this is the first time I'm considering this suggestion, nothing about that strikes me as presenting a legal problem. It seems to satisfy any requirements that Bagley-Keene would have. I don't think that there's anything legally objectionable about that.
Okay.
Well, then there's no reason to wait on that item.
Not that I can tell, no.
Okay. I would move that we amend the proposal to add the third provision, any speaker who wishes to use any form of audiovisual aids in their presentation must seek permission of the chair in advance.
Point of clarification. When you're discussing audiovisual aids, are you including the type of visual aids that were brought, for example, a couple of months ago with pictures that purport to show maps or viewpoints?
Well, I said any form, so that means any form. So, placards that are larger than a piece of paper, a projector of some kind, or, a recording device that they can play out some, testimony or something that they want us to hear. Any form. If they want to do it, get clearance in advance.
Okay.
And that doesn't say how much in advance, because it's flexibility to allow the chair to decide when and how much advance notice he'd like.
We can certainly draft that, and I think I understand where you are. And the only thing that I'm trying to process through in real time here is how we can effectively communicate that to the public so that they know, whether their written comments have to seek permission in advance from the chair, or if they have a picture in their written comments, exactly what the limitations are. If you'd like, we can go, with respect to that provision, draft something that specifically contemplates what I think I understand you're saying, and bring it back to the meeting next month.
Well, I thought it was reasonably clear. I can give you a copy of it.
Oh, I wrote it down. I did write it down.
Did you get, the first time I read it through, I think it didn't give you any form, wishes to use any form of audiovisual aids.
Yes, that's what I wrote down.
Okay.
And again, I think I understand you. My only concern is that I want to make sure all members of the public understand when they read that, what that means. Because the way that it would come up is, at a meeting, somebody would show up, potentially with something very important that they want to show, either by way of picture or written text, and the commission would be at risk of having to say, I'm sorry, you didn't follow the policy. We can't.
And I'd certainly be willing to expand it to include stuff like this, where you get handed a, 40-page document when they come up to the podium.
Certainly, electronic audiovisual aids is much easier to draw a hard line on and give notice to the public on. But if that's less than what you're anticipating, again, we can draft it in a way that is more clear for the public.
Yeah, I didn't want to have to create an all-inclusive list of forms of audiovisual aids. That's why I picked that language.
Yeah.
So that it would be in the discretion of the chair.
May I ask a question? Executive Director Jones, how do you understand the interplay between Commissioner Hatch's requested change and provision 10 under Rules of Order, which says that members of the public shall not bring signs, exhibits? Would exhibits be embraced within Commissioner Hatch's request in your mind?
Well, that was in the back of my mind of trying to figure out how to parse those two with respect to people who come in who have certain limitations about what they can bring in. And if that is broader than what they're able to present, it causes some potential issues, again, just in clarity. And really what these are all about are less having to do with what with the commissioners and more giving notice to the public of this is how we plan on receiving comments. And so I want to make crystal clear to the public what their expectations are. I think we can do that.
Yeah, I read that provision, and it seemed to me more like a bar against 50 people coming in with signs, not planning to speak, but just to get your attention with signs. And that's, I think, a different context than somebody who's providing audio-visual aids for a presentation. And that's why I wrote a separate item. I felt this wasn't covered, and it should be if we're going to do this.
Do we think, does staff think that they can craft something and make it consistent with the other requirements that we have in this proposed policy, given the feedback you've received from Commissioner Hatch at this point?
I think from a drafting perspective that we can. From a legal perspective, I'll throw to Commission Counsel Cornwall and the General Counsel to see if they have any concerns with regard to that.
Yeah, just in drafting it, I would want to alter the language somewhat to, make clear that the audio-visual aids, referenced, obviously wouldn't prevent anyone who needs an audio or visual aid in the sort of ADA context from being able to use that during their presentation. Additionally, I think that it would be good to have the opportunity to do a little bit more research in terms of the legality of placing additional restrictions on written materials that people can present to the commission throughout the course of the commission meeting. But I do think that we could have that by the next meeting.
Okay.
Okay. Well, then I would move that we adopt the policy as presented with the additional instruction that you will craft an addition to the policy in line with what Commissioner Hatch has just proposed for presentation for the commission's approval at the next commission meeting. Additionally, I assume that this policy will be posted on our website and made publicly available and highlighted for the public that these are the rules going forward.
That's the primary intent, is to give notice to the public what the expectations are.
Great. All right. Do I have a second?
I will second with congrats to the staff. I actually appreciate the footnotes. It helps to have some understanding of what is the substantiation behind and where are these ideas coming from. It's entirely consistent with our attempt to establish and maintain and push at the boundaries of best practices. So happy to second this.
Commissioner Carnes?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Great. Again, thank you, Executive Director Jones and Commission Counsel. You guys did a great job on this.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to item 21 then. It's a request for pre-notice, proposed Disclose Act regulation amendments and regulations for adoption. I know we have General Counsel Bainbridge, Senior Commission Counsel Harrison, and Commission Counsel Green. Welcome.
Good morning, Commissioners. Chair Matich, Karen Harrison, Senior Commission Counsel with the Legal Division, and my colleague.
Good morning, Caitlin Green, Commission Counsel, Legal Division.
So we are here for pre-notice discussion of several items that staff has identified through the advice process that require some clarification related to the Disclose Act. We are submitting this for discussion and will present the regulations for adoption at a later hearing. We've identified these issues, and we have two regulations that we propose to amend. The first is Regulation 18435. This is to clarify the advertisement disclosure requirements for mass mailings that are advertisements applicable to a committee other than a political party or a candidate-controlled committee for the elective office of the candidate. The other item under mass mailings for that same regulation is where an individual qualifies as a major donor committee and sends a mass mailing that is personal and not political in nature. Regulation 18450.1 is up for amendment. This is a non-substantive conforming amendment just to adjust a citation reference. For adoption, staff is proposing three regulations. The first is 18450.2 to define authorized and paid for by a committee pursuant to Section 84501. This is to clarify several circumstances. For example, where more than one committee pays for an advertisement, the advertisement's a non-monetary contribution by an individual and coordinated with the committee, or where the costs are nominal or not ascertainable. It also identifies circumstances that qualify as paying for a communication. Under 18450.3, we'll be clarifying top contributor disclosure for major donor committees that qualify with affiliated entity contributions. And then 18450.4 to address the disclosure length for video or television advertisements lasting less than 5 seconds. In addition to these proposed regulations, we're soliciting input from the Commission and from the public regarding any other potential regulatory matters that can be cleaned up related to the Disclose Act. To that end, there'll be an interested persons meeting scheduled for September 24th at 10 o'clock in this location.
Thank you very much. Do we have commissioner comments on this item?
No.
Do we have any public comment at this time on item 21? Seeing none. Thank you very much for
Thank
your work
you.
on this. We look forward to continuing the discussion. All right, moving on then to item 22. These are proposed amendments to Regulation 18422, Multipurpose Organization Political Activity Transparency, and adoption of Regulation 18422.1, Multipurpose Organization Reporting and Record Keeping. Again, we have General Counsel Bainbridge, Supervising Commission Counsel Brar, and Commission Counsel Lewis. Welcome and good morning.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Torrin Lewis, as mentioned, Commission Counsel with the Legal Division, presenting Regulation 18422, amendments to Regulation 18422, as well as proposed Regulation 18422.1 for adoption. As you may recall, both of these regulations were presented to the Commission at the July Commission meeting for pre-notice. So once again, these regulatory changes, which we worked with together with the Enforcement Division as well as the Franchise Tax Board, clarify the reporting and record-keeping requirements for multi-purpose organizations that qualify as committees under Section 84222 of the Act. So following public comment at the July 2019 meeting, staff has made several changes, including further description of non-donor funds, references to requirements for federal committees, some technical changes regarding solicitations to donors, and clarification of the types of accounts subject to record keeping for MPOs. Once again, some background. The Act defines multi-purpose organizations as organizations that receive donations or other payments such as member dues for making, for purposes other than making contributions or expenditures in California. But nevertheless, such organizations do in fact from time to time make such political expenditures in the state of California. In 2014, in response to a landmark dark money case in which an out-of-state nonprofit intermediary funneled $11 million into California elections to support and oppose ballot measures, the legislature passed legislation requiring MPOs that conduct certain levels of political activity in our state to register and file as campaign committees. And so these requirements passed by the legislature are now found in Section 84222 of the Act. So to fast forward to the proposed changes, there are 3 amendments to Regulation 18422 that we are proposing, as well as the expansion of subsection 18422F into its own regulation, which would become 18422.1. First, Staff proposes adding a paragraph B2 to Regulation 18422 to clarify what information has to be included on a multipurpose organization's statement of organization regarding description of its mission, most significant activities, and its political activities. Second, we propose adding a paragraph C4 to Regulation 18422, and this was discussed at the pre-notice in July. This would clarify that MPOs using only non-donor funds, using non-donor funds to make political expenditures in California elections have to provide certain information concerning the type and source of those non-donor funds. Third, for Regulation 18422, staff proposes deleting subdivision F and then expanding that into proposed Regulation 18422.1. So finally, proposed Regulation 18422.1 expands upon that subsection F in the following ways. First, it clarifies the basic record-keeping requirements that apply to all committees under Regulation 18401, the existing regulation covering record-keeping requirements for all committees. Similarly apply to MPOs that qualify as committees, including publicly funded nonprofits. Second, it details specific forms of required record-keeping and documentation that are unique to MPOs, such as grant agreements and solicitations to donors. Third, it addresses unique record-keeping requirements for MPOs that, again, use non-donor funds for political activities in California. And finally, a subdivision D specifies that federal or out-of-state PACs, which qualify as committees pursuant to the Act, must only keep records in accordance with reportable activity in the state of California. Whereas records related only to out-of-state or federal activities may be kept in accordance with the appropriate federal or state record-keeping laws. So again, these proposed changes would ensure proper compliance under the Act for MPOs, as well as strengthening the ability of the Enforcement Division and Franchise Tax Board to conduct audits that they are tasked with properly completing under the Act. And that concludes rather my overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Do we have commission comment on this?
Yes, just first of all, I would just want to congratulate you on a job well done. I think you've done a really good piece of work here. Just to verify public record, the first change in 22, the Statement of Organization information, the IRS form contains all of this and perhaps more information, correct, on that subject matter?
Let me just double check, Commissioner, before I answer your question. So this is regarding page 2, line 6. An organization may comply with this requirement by referencing its IRS statement of tax statement, rather, and where that may be accessed.
Right, yeah, that's exactly what I was speaking. I'm sorry, I should have given you a page and line number. Was my understanding that, in fact, if you have access to that IRS form, you got all the information that we're requesting above in that paragraph?
Got it. So information regarding its mission, its most significant activities, and its political activities. I would say, broadly speaking, yes. For example, in the case of organizations that file the Form 990, there are requirements stating the mission, and some information is captured there regarding the organization's political activities. The overlap between the kind of information we would be seeking is not literally the same, but yes, there would be information that the public could access about that.
Okay, thank you. And then where is it? Oh, I know. The last amendment where it strikes the existing record-keeping requirement and then adds the other. It seems to me that, and I'm very satisfied with that record-keeping requirement. I just wanted to point out that because of sort of the uniqueness of these entities, it would not have sufficed to just simply make a cross-reference to the existing record-keeping requirements. Is that not true?
That is correct.
Yeah, so these are, in essence, the same standard, but applied to their uniqueness. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you.
Do other commissioners have comments? Commissioner Hayward?
Thank you. On page 4, line 15, which is subparagraph B of 4, whatever that is, I'm not quite sure what I think the right answer should be, but I feel like we're asking filers to do something they may not be able to do. When you've got non-donor funds, by definition, you've got funds that were gained through something other than getting a donation from somebody, right? So maybe you've got a pile of money in an investment account that comes from a T-bill that came due and some GE dividends and who knows what all. And you pay out of that investment account. I guess I feel like since we don't have that sort of dark money funneling threat of corruption in this context when we're using non-donor funds, calling it investment income seems to me to be pretty good. And then trying to get to the source of that investment income seems to me to be pretty hard and also not really necessary to fulfill the purpose that this reg is trying to fulfill. So I'd like your comments on that. I was just struck with, if I were advising somebody in a situation like I've described, I'm not sure I would know what to tell them to do.
Yeah, I think the concern that drove this amendment was that some organizations were simply referencing broad categories of non-donor funds, and that without further specifics, that would be hard to verify, say, in case of an audit. And so in order to fully complete an audit, simply having an assurance that an MPO, say, used funds from the sale of assets or income received from advertisements without actual information about the source of those funds, it's essentially relying upon merely that statement alone in good faith that that's where it came from. And so by requiring the actual source, auditors could actually substantiate what class of non-donor funds was used.
But now I feel like you're conflating the public disclosure interest and transparency interest with the record keeping, we'll need to verify it later interest, and they're two different things. So again, when it comes to telling the world where this non-donor money came from, in the hypothetical I've presented, I'm not sure what my client would put down because I'm not sure my client knows. Are they supposed to do last in, first out of that investment account and go, oh, well, the last money I got was from a T-bill coming due, and that's more than adequate to cover the money I just spent, so I'll say T-bill. Or is there some, what I get back to is I'm not sure that there's a public transparency interest that's being served here that outweighs the fact that we're asking people to do something very difficult.
Well, can I ask a question, though? Because I think that's in.
Sure.
Commissioner Hayward made the point, I think, that in her mind there's a difference between transparency and the transparency interest and the record-keeping requirement.
Yeah.
I actually see them as being joined at the hip and essential for each other, because I don't know how you can ensure adequate and accurate transparency if the records aren't there to substantiate it. Otherwise, anyone can essentially make up what they want. Is that why we're using record-keeping here to increase transparency? I mean, is that part of this?
I agree with you that they're joined at the hip. In this regulation, the requirements that Commissioner Hayward is talking about would be on the campaign report for the public to see versus the other regulation where it would be part of the record keeping where only auditors or other enforcement types would see other than the committee. I think the purpose of the changes here in this regulation are for the public to see where the money is coming from.
All right. But I do, having said that, I do actually have some questions about subparagraph B, because, for example, just playing off that hypothetical, if there was a sale of investment, the source was investment income, let's say. The type, where you say the name of the entity where the investment-producing investment is or was held. So is that, Charles Schwab, like a Charles Schwab account? That would be the identity of the entity where it's held. And presumably, what you would want is the type of stock that was sold, right? I mean, that's what we're getting at. Mm-hmm. But it actually doesn't say that specifically. It just says, and identifying information for assets sold.
Correct.
So I wonder if there's a way to clarify precisely what we mean, because part of my concern here is from the regulated community standpoint, their understanding of what information is may be different than our understanding, and it'll continue this frustration. So is there a way to clarify that further? And maybe that's something we refine over time, but just when I look at this, it's not clear to me what exactly we're asking them to give us if you just say information.
I agree. That is something that we can refine over time.
Do you have additional commissioner comments on this? All right, let's move to public comment then. Do we have any public comment on this item?
Hi, Chair, members. Nicholas Heidorn with California Common Cause. First, a quick mea culpa. Staff did reach out to Common Cause a few weeks ago to try and get our input on this. We have looked at it, but don't feel we've looked at it enough to be able to give you our strong comments. So really our request here today is if it is not urgent to pass this regulation now, if you could delay by another month, that would give us more chance to check in. Currently what we're doing, Common Cause, is a chapter-based organization. We have a national office. A lot of our finances go through the chapter, then to the national, so we're trying to find out from the national finance folks, would this change our practices? What would it mean, or can it exist with existing practice? Well, in a larger context, I'll of course say Common Cause. We supported SB 27. We're very supportive of the goal of ensuring robust transparency and, of course, the ability of the Commission to audit to ensure that that's being accomplished. Where we have concerns is primarily with the record-keeping requirements under $1,000, or actually maybe even not concerns. We just need to have a better understanding of how this would really affect smaller organizations that don't have dedicated staff, principally to just handling incoming money like ours. Some of the items that we're looking at, it would be, we understand that some of these requirements are parallel to what recipient committees have to do, but maybe there have been some changes within the MPO context. If there could be some clarification of what the differences are, that could help us better understand how this regulation would work for organizations like ours. I note that one of the standards for record keeping requires, this is A1A, the accounts of records must contain a continuous computation of reportable fund balances. I wonder if that means that an organization like ours would need to know on a daily basis what our current funds are, if that's the intent there. If not, maybe softer language like allow the creation of a computation of what our fund balances were, certainly to allow auditing. Something like that is something we're looking at and would hope that might be considered with additional time. There's also a section that was alluded to by staff regarding correspondence with granting agencies and having to keep all correspondence. I do wonder, does that mean any emails we have with our program officer? Does that mean any preliminary conversations? These are not things we would normally be keeping in the course of business, so just some clarification there would be helpful, and that would also be something we'd be looking at and trying to understand. So primarily at this point, we're simply requesting additional time to take a look at it if the Commission can allow it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Helen Hutchison with the League of Women Voters of California, and I want to join Nicholas's request that we have another month to look at this for the same reasons that he stated. Thank you.
Morning, Emily Andrews from Olson, Hagel, and Fishburne. I'm here on behalf of the CPAA, California Political Attorneys Association, and the Regulatory Committee. I think all of you we submitted a letter earlier this week regarding our comments on the proposed regulation, as well as some draft changes that we're proposing to the language. I'm not going to probably repeat all of the comments from that letter, but I just want to emphasize, that our primary concern here is that the current version of the draft record-keeping regulation really attempts to apply a one-size-fits-all approach to various types of multi-purpose organizations and largely treats those multi-purpose organizations in a similar manner as recipient committees. What we're dealing here is with organizations that are often only engaging in a minimal amount of California political activity, and in some circumstances, the draft regulation is really imposing requirements on these organizations for record keeping of items that they ordinarily wouldn't even be keeping records of, and sort of requiring those organizations to prove a negative in some circumstances. I mean, really by having to keep records of items that they might not otherwise be keeping, and having to be mindful of that because maybe they made 2 California political contributions and now they've qualified as a multi-purpose organization. So we would just request consideration of the changes that we've proposed to try and, I think, make this something that multi-purpose organizations can comply with in a reasonable manner. The other point I think that we made in our letter, which I would ask you to consider, is with respect to the changes to 18422 on the non-donor funds issue. The statute requires that multi-purpose organizations that use non-donor funds include a brief description of the type of funds, and so I would ask the Commission to consider that in assessing the type of description that's required to be used on the campaign filings, and perhaps further considering what records are appropriate for the record keeping and proving the type of funds that were used versus the description that actually goes on to the campaign report. Thank you.
Is there any additional public comment on this item?
Mr. Chair, this is not a new tactic of waiting to the last minute and then asking for more time. This regulation was first posted in July. There was ample opportunity there. We got very little input. Again, during that month in between, we had a interested parties meeting, and now here we are at the last minute saying, put it over and we'll try and do the work that we should have done a few months ago. Some of the suggestions seem like, to me, looking for less transparency. And from an earlier item that we were discussing today, the problem of trying to prosecute a case when there are not adequate records because they just didn't supply them. And so for one, I would like to move that we adopt this today. If, on reflection and after hearing from these parties, if there's something really important that should be reconsidered, I would be happy to entertain doing a separate reg proposal on that, but I'm not going to wait. I move for adoption.
I'm going to second that.
Can I offer what I hope is a friendly amendment? I really do prefer the description of non-donor funds that was prepared by the CPAA. I think it solves the problem I'm identifying with just actually not being able to answer the question that we're asking people because they don't have a good answer. And I think it provides for enough specificity that when audit time comes, the auditors will know to look in investment income or sale of goods or something like that and ascertain whether or not people are blowing wind up people's skirts or whether or not they're telling the truth. So that would be my proposal.
Just to clarify, we're talking here about 18422C4?
Yes.
And
I'm proposing C4 just being the C4 that's on page 4 of the CPAA comments, not a sub A and sub B.
I don't have a copy of that.
Is that the letter that came in yesterday? Yeah, no, that's the one that came in yesterday.
So it's the underlined would substitute for the existing one, and so now I would have to side by side, word for word.
What, if I can help, that what this is doing is eliminating or what is it, subparagraph? What is that called? Subparagraph B there, from our version. So it would essentially just be that subparagraph A is what would be the provision. B is what they have proposed eliminating.
What's your perspective on that, Mr. Bainbridge?
It results in a little less disclosure. You don't have the specifics of where the sources were coming from, which is actually the issue that the two of you had identified. I think there's a little less disclosure, a little less specificity for the public. Eventually, an auditor could get to that information, but it never becomes public. I don't think it's a deal breaker in my mind, but I think it is a little less information about specifically what these non-donor funds are. In the instance where non-donor funds are liquid, I understand the concern is, well, what TD Ameritrade, great, what does that tell us about this? When the non-donor funds are raised in different ways, there may be instances where the more specificity would be useful. And I know you want an example, and I'm trying to remember what the example was right now in my head. Maybe, do you guys remember what? There was an example of other forms of non-donor funds where we thought it would be helpful to have this additional information of where it's coming from.
I think it was what we wrote down here about. Sorry, I think it was what we have here at the end of A about sale of assets or other receipts that aren't donations, including but not limited to income received from advertisements, promotions, tributes, royalties, rents, or leases.
Yeah, if I could, I would resist that amendment. The core issue that brought this to my attention was the persistent reporting of non-donor funds as simply, quote, non-donor funds, unquote. That you can't audit anything. I don't care how good an audit standards you have. There's nothing to audit. Without this particular paragraph written as the staff has written it, we again will have nothing to audit, and which is going to make folks happy that want to involve themselves in dark money efforts. This is fine the way it is. If they can make a case later on that a word here or two might be changed, they can come back with a proposal.
Additional commissioner comments?
I would prefer the language in the report, the proposed regulation as prepared and offered up by staff. Speaking for myself, I'm not prepared to support this in any event today. I think I really need some more time, and I say that with no particular pride, but that this is not an uncomplicated matter, nor are the stakes relatively low here, and I just haven't gone through the machinations to understand what this might be missing. So I defer to the balance of my colleagues and their preference, but I'm not prepared to support it today.
I continue to think that 4B is going to vex people, and you might end up with disclosure that isn't very helpful. But having not succeeded in offering that as a friendly amendment, I am perfectly happy to support the draft as it stands.
I just wanted to note we have a public comment, and I wanted to make sure that the commissioners saw that too. Okay.
Yes.
We have these wonderful monitors in front of us now, so yes, we see it in all of its glory in a 150-point. Thank you, Mr. Lang, wherever you are.
I guess the one comment I would make is I appreciate CPA's extensive letter and commentary, as well as what Mr. Lang has pointed out and other folks who spoke today. But really, this was pre-notice 2 months ago. And to the extent that these concerns that are being raised today and yesterday are significant concerns, we have the opportunity to refine this regulation over time if they actually manifest themselves. Otherwise, I tend to agree with Commissioner Hatch and others that I think this is something that we should move on today. We've had sufficient time. Please.
Yeah, and in that regard, you know, a certain was made that if this isn't urgent, maybe we could put it off for a month. But the problem with that is we have a very ambitious regulatory calendar as it is. And doing that just has cascading effects into next year. And so, again, you know, I failed in my friendly amendment. I think in bulk, it's a good reg, and we'll have to deal with whatever picayune specific issues particular organizations have when they come up. We have letters and opinions for those sorts of things in addition to rulemaking. So anyway, I just wanted to the extent people think that there's some reason why procrastinating or waiting is somehow costless, I want to assure you that it's not.
If I could, I might add, before you call the roll, that some of these things that have been raised today are the kind of things that would be handled in an advice request. And this, you know, for further clarification as to how you comply with this or that. And I think they need to test drive it before they decide how to fix it.
Yeah, I actually had a question along those lines, and that is, if, in light of some of the concerns that have been raised, which I think are they're valid concerns potentially, is there a natural time period at which we should come back and look at this reg and how it's operating? You know, is 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? What would be a good time period in your estimation if we wanted to engage in that type of review of this regulation?
I don't have any data on how many MPOs there are, because I'm thinking we would need some time for there to be enough, a sample size that's significant enough. I really can't say. I would think at least 6 months of trying it out. Really what I would want to do is check in with FTB at some point whenever they get around to auditing under these regulations and see how it's going on their end. So once they've done that, we could check with them and then check back with the regulated community at that point. And okay, here's what FTB is saying. How do you feel it's going? What are still some issues that you're seeing? So I would say 6 months to a year, going off the top of my head. I think it's going to take a fair amount of time to try it out. Since we got these comments on Tuesday afternoon and they are very dense, we can take a look at them now and see if there's anything that leaps out at us, like, oh, we missed this. This is something we definitely should be correcting. You know, something that doesn't need to be tried out to see how it works, which our staff is happy to do.
Okay. You could bring something back to us in that case.
Yeah, if we see something, we'll report back and doing the reg calendar for next year in November. So we could even put it on there if we needed to.
All right. Well, I think that's good. I think we should keep this on the radar, something to keep an eye on.
Mr. Chair, may I ask staff, one of the comments that we received on this matter raised the question of whether or not there is something other than a one-size-fits-all, which this is suggested to be. Do we have any thoughts on how a bifurcation might be structured or at least imagined, such that quote-unquote smaller MPOs wouldn't have the same kind of burden, if you will, as larger, more complex regular players might?
I'll say that I disagree with the comment that this is a one-size-fits-all. This regulation really follows what the statute says about the types of thresholds that apply depending on what type of committee qualifies as a committee under the statute. So we're really following what the statute says and the thresholds that are provided in the law. And so it's not really a one-size-fits-all. It's following what the statute says and the thresholds that are provided there and applying those to MPOs and making it clear that they need to keep records to follow the statute.
All right. So we have a motion. Go ahead and call the roll.
Commissioner Cardenas?
No.
Commissioner Hatch? Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. It's almost 11:30. I'm looking at the agenda, wondering if we might take this opportunity to do the closed session now, break for lunch for a half an hour after that, and then come back and complete the agenda. How do folks feel about that? Good? All right. Is there a staff issue with that, or can we do that?
We just have public comment on the closed agenda item, so as long as we take that first, then we can do that.
Great. Well, let's proceed to public comment then on the closed session.
Chair members, Nicholas Heidorn with California Common Cause. We just wanted to urge you to take up the appeal in the SB 1107 litigation to petition the Supreme Court to review the opinion. Money in politics remains an issue of bipartisan concern. Americans and Californians largely feel that special interests have too much sway within our politics. Unfortunately, in the past decade, we've seen Supreme Court opinions that continue to limit the ability to regulate money in politics, Citizens United being just one more famous decision, but others have limited our ability. One of the prime tools that we still have to try and ensure that the voice of the public is heard, that it isn't big money, special interest dominating the process, is through the public financing of elections. In fact, just in the past 2 years, we've seen a resurgence of interest at the local level in public financing. LA just strongly solidified its public financing system. Berkeley just adopted a new public financing system. I think this past week, San Francisco increased from, I think, a 2-to-1 to a 6-to-1 matching system, and Oakland is in the process of revisiting it. The thing is, all those jurisdictions are charter cities, so under current law, they have the ability to do that. This surge of interest that we're seeing is currently limited to charter cities because of Prop 73 and the interpretation that SB 1107, amending Prop 73 to allow other governments to do public financing if they wish, was not viable. I think in addition to the huge public interest behind this, there's strong reason to appeal this because I don't think that the decision was correctly decided. The crux of the legal issue here is whether Proposition 73 changed the purposes of the PRA itself. If you take just the standard purposes of the PRA, either as articulated in the findings or the purposes section of the PRA, or as courts have interpreted the purpose of the PRA, for example, to combat corruption, it is quite clear that public financing supports that. In fact, in the letter, I quote a Supreme Court opinion from our California Supreme Court saying it is essentially obvious that public financing supports the role of combating corruption. So really the only question is whether the Prop 73 itself changed the role of the PRA. The court in this case held that it did. However, we think there's stronger reasons to argue that it didn't, or at least this is something that the Supreme Court ought to take another look at. There's another court opinion, Common Cause versus FPPC, about a decade ago, where the court rejected Common Cause's attempt to have the ban on public financing held to be inviolable. And the court essentially said, well, look, you can just amend this provision by 2/3 vote of the legislature. And that's what happened there. So we think, one, there's already a direct conflict between what one court of appeals said and what a second court of appeals said. Second, there's the argument of whether or not this amended the purpose of the PRA. I won't go into the extensive briefing. I think there's strong argument that they didn't intend to. They didn't modify the purposes. They didn't say this provision couldn't be amended. But even more so than that, there are direct opinions by Supreme Court justices saying that they did not change the purpose of the PRA. I quote in the letter a quote from Justice Mosk, who says the point of Prop 73, that ban on public financing, was not an end unto itself, even of Prop 73. This was simply language that was inserted in competition with another proposition. So to sum that all up, we think this is an incredibly important issue for California, for the reform community, and we think this is a legal issue that is not only contested, but is one where we have Supreme Court justices who have given strong statements in a concurrence opinion, albeit, that goes contrary to how this appellate court ruled. So for those reasons, we encourage the Commission to petition the Supreme Court to review this so the Supreme Court can finally weigh in on this issue. Thank you.
Question?
Yes.
In making this recommendation and setting aside the state cost for this, do you think that the community is better off making, once we file an appeal, then I assume the legislature is not going to be particularly interested in doing something until they hear what the outcome is? And do you think that works? I mean, in light of that, are you still you feel strongly that we should appeal this?
The good government community, Clean Money, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, we all support an appeal in this matter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Helen Hutchison with the League of Women Voters of California, and strongly support asking for an appeal, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional public comment? All right, if not, then the plan is then to adjourn into closed session, after which we will adjourn for a 30-minute lunch and then reconvene after that. So, thank you. All right, we are reconvening after a lunch break, and right before lunch, we actually met in closed session to receive an update on litigation from our general counsel, and we have nothing to report from that closed session. So we're on to the next item, which is item 23. This is entitled a review of our commission policy manual. This is something that I had asked for staff to come to us with information on our existing internal policies, and that the commission manual seems to be a compilation of internal policies, including our statement of incompatible activities, and more broadly, the types of activities that commissioners are advised to avoid. So my hope is that through this review, we can get an understanding of what those internal rules of conduct are, and come to some agreement to what they should be going forward. So for purposes of today, because this is a lengthy manual, my hope was that we could break it up and do this over successive meetings. For purposes of today, I'd like to start with chapters 3 and 4, if the other commissioners were willing to indulge me on that. So Executive Director Jones, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add by way of introduction before we begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This manual, I was remiss in not saying last time, this is really, we think it's one of the tools that we can provide to commissioners as a staff, particularly new commissioners, that can give them some guidance so that they are not taking the dais cold the first time that they come in. Much of it, probably 90% of it is merely a reflection of the law. For example, it contains a guide to Bagley-Keene. The new governance principles were added last year. The ALJ procedures, and soon we'll put in the public participation rules that there's pictures of the commissioners in there. But over the years, it's my understanding in my travels around the office, this has been a helpful guide to new commissioners that will allow them to hit the ground running when they first take on the role. Obviously, if present commissioners disagree, we can rejigger our processes, but this is consistent with the practice across the U.S. in some manner or form for ethics agencies to have some preparatory material. I did, at the request of a couple of commissioners, I did go back and try and figure out what the genesis of this particular manual is. The best that I can get is it's been developed over time. Some of it has been before commissions, some of it has not been. It is regularly updated by staff as new law becomes available or new facts. In particular, the pictures are current, and we did not bring that before the commission to make sure that the picture was the right one. So with that being said, with regard to most of this, it's merely a reflection of what facts and law already are. It does appear that chapters 3 and 4 may or may not have extra requirements that previous commissions have decided to bind themselves by, and that's completely up to the commission, provided it's not inconsistent with the law. The commission can regulate itself in any way that it wants, so it's largely a policy discussion. With that in mind, whatever the commission decides, the staff is here to help you move forward with whatever you agree on.
All right, thank you. So perhaps we can start with Chapter 3. Do commissioners have particular aspects of Chapter 3 that they would like to discuss?
Before you get to that, just on an overall basis, this is a 53-page document, and perhaps I should have read the first page a little closer. It would have saved me some heartaches, but I was comparing with the manual that I received when I came on, And so I thought someone had updated this, and what in fact it was is this is just the most recent one, June of this year, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so this is not, something you've updated per se, so little things like the maximum gift is not correct because it was correct back in June, but it's not now, those kinds of things. If as we go forward on this stuff, because it is pretty voluminous, when you make any changes, from the June one to now, could you highlight the changes somehow so that it's easier for us to follow?
We can definitely do that.
Thank you.
And for those purposes, I will highlight the fact that my picture is now in there, in case the commission wanted to, and the chair's picture is now in there as well. Those are two of the changes that were made immediately before June.
But otherwise, it's the June version.
That's my understanding. I think the last substantive change, my understanding is the last substantive change was the new governance principles were added to the manual up front.
All right, do we have commissioner comments then on Chapter 3?
Well, I have a question, Chair, if I might, that is not specific to Chapters 3 and 4, but more broadly in the nature of these types of manuals. The executive director suggested that a review of practices across other states is that other state commissions have similar manuals for themselves, for their own constitution and comportment, et cetera. I'm just wondering, in what ways or other ways does staff, with any frequency at all, canvass best practices per se across state ethics commissions? There is some kind of a state organization, national organization of ethics officers or something. How does that body, if it does exist, there, I'm seeing a shaking head. There is.
Yes.
Such okay. How does our staff keep current with either what's happening at that body or with respect to state commissions more generally?
With respect to the Council on Governmental Ethics Law, which is the national body, we do have a member of our staff, Suki Brar, who is on the programming committee for that national organization. So we do have sort of boots on the ground within that organization. That organization, however, does not provide best practices for commissioners' manuals across the U.S. That's typically done within the commissions themselves. I can tell you about the two commissions with which I'm most recently familiar, and that's the state of Vermont and the state of Connecticut. With respect to the state of Connecticut, they have a collection of materials that are given to each commissioner as they come on board, which are updated immediately after an appointment is made. Immediately after an appointment is made, all of the heads of the various divisions of the staff create a memo saying this is what we do now to make sure that it's current with current law, and invites them to come in. They also, in the state of Connecticut, they do a full day training for each commissioner where they come in before they're sworn in and sort of figure out, who's who and what's what and how it works on a daily basis. With respect to the state of Vermont, who just enacted their first ethics agency a year and a half ago, they're in the process of putting together a manual similar to this that is kind of a document that is iterative but sort of floats freestanding from commissioner to commissioner. Those are the two I'm familiar with, but I'm also familiar with other agencies that have this type of manual. The ethics agency and the elections agency in Massachusetts have a similar type manual. The city of Philadelphia has a similar type of manual. The state of Pennsylvania has a similar type of manual. So most of the ethics agencies that I've been familiar with and have worked with have some flavor of a guide that, and again, the primary directive of this is to help new commissioners get up to speed very quickly in kind of a condensed form. These are the most important salient things that you need to know to engage fully as a commissioner right away.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Commissioner Hayward?
So I guess my concern is sort of balancing, how much of this document is a sort of didactic summary of what the law requires, and how much of this is sort of aspirational. And I think my concern about this is strongest in the section that talks about ex parte communications when we're talking about commission opinions and rulemaking. I have no problem with the ex parte communications and enforcement matters part. I think that is really solid, states the law as it exists, and gives people concrete information on how they should comply with it. The rulemaking and commission opinion sections, I think, have a bit more of that sort of aspirational flavor to them. And it's not clear to me that the commission has ever explicitly said, you know what? There's no requirement to report ex parte communications in these contexts, but we're going to anyway. Or there's no requirement, but we'll leave it to the commissioner's judgment. Or there's no requirement and there's no requirement. I mean, those are each things that this document could say that would be potentially true if we voted on them and discussed them. But right now we've got a document that has a discussion about how Bagley-Keene might apply to ex parte communications. I guess the idea there being is if you had some exposure to some information outside of a commission meeting and you didn't tell anybody about what it was, that somehow is denying the public a complete record. But then there's another theory. It goes on to say the ex parte communications are beneficial and don't need to be announced. So it's it's a bit of a mishmash. I'm not going to be super picky about this, but I also think that the cases that are cited on pages 18 and 19 are not cited for propositions that they stand for, but be that as it may. And then we have some hypotheticals that are really, I'm not sure they're that helpful. Again, because there's an element of aspirational, we're going beyond the law, that muddies sort of the conversation about what the law requires. Now, I happen to be of the opinion that ex parte, the very few ones I've had, because this doesn't happen very often, but the few contacts I've had from the outside in between meetings on opinions or rulemaking kind of go hand in hand with other research I might do in between meetings. The newspapers I might read, the cases I might look up, and I don't write a memo about all of that stuff when I come to a meeting. I come to the meeting hoping that I can be convincing because I know some things, and maybe I am and maybe I'm not, and that's fine, and we vote and move on. Now, other people I think would say, no, an ex parte contact is different than just that research you're talking about. There's a potential for maybe coercion because you're talking to another human being. Now, it's never happened, and like I say, ex parte contacts don't happen very often. When they have happened, I've felt like the person telling me something had something really useful to tell me. But it wasn't a coercive situation. It wasn't a quid pro quo kind of thing because I don't have a quo to quid. You know, I'm not a legislator. I'm not a fundraiser. I'm just me gas-bagging about campaign finance law. And so, like I say, my preference is that I would be able to keep whatever personal conversations I have with people about matters here to myself. But if we as a commission decided on a different standard, I'll do that too. But what I don't like about where we are right now with the manual is there's no explicit, and this is what we've decided, this is the standard that we're embracing. It's kind of a, well, you could do this, maybe it would be a good idea to do this, but on the other hand, you don't really have to, and that's not a good position for us to be in, I don't think. If we're going to have a standard, we should all know what that standard is, and we'll all follow it, and I'll be fine. So that's what I wanted to say about that part of the manual, and I think that's really my one big point. I thought everything else seemed pretty reasonable. I feel like the political activities section might be a little broad. Again, if we're going to say, well, the law requires us not participating in or donating to, campaigns in the state of California, and we understand that to mean federal offices as well as state offices, including the president, who runs nationally, then let's kind of tease that out. How much of that is what the statute requires and how much of that is an aspirational thing we're putting on ourselves? Because again, I think that's another section where they're kind of mushed together, and I'm not quite sure we've explicitly decided to hold ourselves to a higher standard or to not hold ourselves to a higher standard.
Thank you. Commissioner Hatch or Commissioner Cardenas, either of you have comments?
I think I find myself in agreement with what Commissioner Hayward just expressed. There is an appropriate distinction between what the law requires and that which may be aspirational. And there's not perhaps a very clear delineation in the manual, chapters 3 and 4, and otherwise, perhaps, of which is which, and why there would be something beyond what the law simply requires, much less any articulation that a particular commission at a particular time said, we commit to being aspirational. And I think this may be an appropriate occasion to make that kind of a demarcation. The Political Reform Act, it seems to me, is in its essence aspirational. So it is both law, but it aspires. It calls us to be greater. And this commission has a role, I think, to lead in that particular regard. And so I'd like to see a delineation between what does the law simply require in more of a kind of a utilitarian type of sense. You know, we can merely comply, but also what does the law invite us to aspire to, and therefore the commissioners individually and as a body will hold themselves to that particular standard, more of a deontological or even more of a virtue ethics, which I think is the heart and soul of the people's intent in '74. So I'd like to see that kind of a delineation, and then commissioners can decide when there are more specific aspirational type suggestions before us whether or not we think we're good to go with that.
Commissioner Hatch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking to Chapter 3, I think was invited here. There are some small things and some very big things in terms of my passion here, but I'll try to deal with the small things first. I agree with Commissioner Hayward that I think the term she used was aspirational versus requirements. And the lines in Chapter 3 are blurred very badly. I had used good practice as a euphemism, but it's the same idea. Before we make, and because we're going to elevate this to something that we approve or don't approve, which elevates what this language contains in this document, I would like for our overworked legal staff to parse, if you will, even if this is as little as highlighting the things that are not requirements, so that we can take those separately when we come back to this. In other words, it does a pretty good job of citing sections of law and regulations that require us to do something or not do something. But then you'll intersperse, you'll have, but you may want to think of this or not do that. And some of them are detectable and others are not. It's not really clear whether this is aspirational or not. So I would like for us to come back with a document that, or at least with this chapter, that highlights the ones that are not requirements, that are not required by law or regulation, to separate it out so that we can make value decisions on what, if anything, we're going to impose on ourselves above that statutory or regulatory requirement. And I think it's important to, and there is also some terminology that was kind of tossed around here that maybe for the lawyers on the commission, it doesn't need to be explained, but I was a non-lawyer, I still am. And I think tossed around an expression of, let's see, the issues of bias and fairness. It's repeated. Is that a term of art? And I know you didn't write this, so this is way back. Is there like a body of law that deals with the question of bias and fairness? If so, it should be either citable or hyperlinked so that people can look at it, future commissioners, because I still don't know. But it's a sort of a thing that's used to caution us not to do the thing that it also says we can do. And so you say you can do this, but you should consider issues of bias and fairness. Well, it's not helping me a lot. And as one who was victimized by this very chapter when I was barely 2 months old in this position, it's kind of a point of sensitivity. Again, sticking with Chapter 3, I noticed the gift limits were incorrect, but now I understand that this was the June 19 version, which was correct at the time. The reference under both the paragraphs on ban on honoraria and conflicts, ban on honoraria and conflicts of fairness, conflicts of interest, it would have been paragraph E and F. It's page 12 on my old handbook, but I think it's probably around page 17 or 18.
16 on the.
18?
Okay. 16 on the one that was on the agenda.
Okay. So my point there is on the first one, E, ban on honoraria, it tells us that we should always check, and I think it's underlined always. It says with the chair and the executive director, but in fact, practically speaking, that should be the general counsel. And being as I lived this, I feel strongly about that. And also likewise, under conflict of interest, it says that I should discuss it. In this case, it says, please discuss it with the chair or general counsel. And to me, that also should just be the general counsel. We'll beat that to death, the next one on my list. Again, yeah, I covered bias and fairnesses. And then elsewhere in this chapter, it also talks about that we're strongly urged to do things. And my question in my head was, who's urging this and why? Because that's not black and white. I mean, if I'm urging you to do something, it's not saying you have to do it or that you should do it. It's just the writer of the day, he's probably dead now, wanted to urge us to do that. So that's just a little too murky for me. And then I would like to come back to this item with more information in our hands, knowing which is clearly required and which is aspirational so that we can deal with the aspirational issues as they come. That's what I have on Chapter 3. As to Chapter 4, I think my chief concern about that is this infringement on my constitutional rights of free speech. And when I say free speech, I mean it as it's known as money as speech. I can't give $20 to some presidential candidate who may or may not even get to the California ballot because it says here in this case in Chapter 4, this was adopted by a commission, so it's binding on us as it is. I think that it's an abridgment of my rights, and I think I did find a section of law that was enacted some years later that say that no one at the commission is allowed to abridge anyone's free speech rights, and I would think that that would include me. And if you contrast that to some of the other things that are explicitly said to be okay, it makes it all the more laughable. Now, I will spare you the painful regurgitation of all the reasons why I think that the view that we are required to have this interpretation by statute, I just don't think it's true at all, and it wouldn't hold up under judicial scrutiny if anyone had the money to waste to go to court. But we shouldn't have to do that. While saying on the one hand, I can't make a contribution, on the other hand, it validates a process that I learned about in 1973 when I first became a lobbyist, and that was when the governor holds a fundraiser, he parades out all of his show ponies, his department heads, his cabinet members, all of those folks, to mingle and chit-chat with the various lobbyists who paid the price of admission. And we, in this document, say that's okay, that we can accept the invitation to go to a fundraiser without paying for it, because we can't pay for anything because of the other parts of it. And yet, we're allowed to color the atmosphere that we're kind of basically open for business, as they used to say. You know, I'm bringing out all my key decision makers for you to get chummy with over cocktails and perhaps even dinner in some cases. It sends a really bad message, and we should not be validating that in our standard whenever we finally adopt. I think that's all I got, Mr. Chair.
Well, I think, thank you, all the commissioners for their comments on this. As I said, I think, to me, this is the sort of the first time that we're talking about this. I think it's good that we've had the information. I sort of, as a big picture comment, I agree that the first step perhaps is to have the general counsel and his staff identify for us what the legal requirements are in chapters 3 and 4 to help commissioners differentiate between what they must do as opposed to what we may wish to do or not do as a matter of internal policy. As part of that, I think it would be helpful, though, to have one of the commissioners assist staff in that endeavor. In particular, it seems to me that one of us should probably be the one to evaluate the non-legal requirement piece of this. So to the extent that there are items in here that are best practices, for lack of a better term, I think having one of us do some research and work with staff on that to turn it into something for all of us to consider at a future meeting probably makes the most sense to me. So I think as a threshold matter, I would ask Mr. Bainbridge, if you and your staff for a future meeting could prepare for us for chapters 3 and 4, something that just very easily for us highlights what are the legal requirements so that we can look at that and know that we have no flexibility there. I think that would be helpful. With respect to the other items in these two policies in chapters 3 and 4, to the extent they are not legal requirements, I would ask that the commission approve having Commissioner Cardenas work with staff to evaluate whether these additional rules that we are essentially then imposing on ourselves, the non-legal requirements, are best practices and look at other ethics agencies, both here in California, by the way, and in other states, because I know LA Ethics, I imagine, has rules of internal conduct, and San Diego Ethics, San Francisco Ethics. So I think getting more information to the commissioners would be beneficial in evaluating what rules we want to impose upon ourselves, if any. So I think that would be sort of the first motion I would make is have staff identify for us in chapters 3 and 4 the legal requirements, and have Commissioner Cardenas work with staff to bring back information to us on best practices.
I'd like to second that, but before I do, could I offer a friendly amendment that we also ask staff to work on these aspirational issues, if they are aware of any source documentation that they could cite it, whether it's another ethics commission or some paper that's been done that would provide a guidance to a new commissioner.
Yes, I think that's something that I would hope Commissioner Cardenas would take the lead on, just to be honest with you, because I think if we're imposing it on ourselves, I think we ought to be the ones kind of doing the research.
Coming back to us to make those decisions, it would be helpful if they can cite where this aspirational language came from, or what it reinforces it, that type of thing.
Yes, I agree with that.
I second the motion.
All right. Any discussion on the motion?
I appreciate the confidence, yeah.
All right. Is there any public comment on that motion? I have a second motion I'd like to make, but just on this motion.
Although I'm not a member of the public, I just did want to let the commission know a lot of these policies derive from Section 83105 of the Government Code, which is the statute that affects commissioners of this body. But because it's a statute that only affects 5 people at max in the state, there's not a lot of law on it. Obviously, the legal division will do its best to give you what the law is, but you can imagine how there might not be a whole lot of case law to grab onto with respect to certainty.
Right. And I think as pertains to this motion, the specific request is that staff go through and simply highlight, and I do mean you can use a highlighter if you want, highlight the provisions in these 2 chapters that are legally required. And then as to those that are not legally required, Commissioner Cardenas would be performing research with some assistance from your staff, and then providing us the support for those best practices. So this isn't the 83105
Thank you.
issue at this point.
Yeah, it's similarly, in the terrific piece of work on the
participation.
Yeah, the document we just approved earlier today, where you cited where these various time limits and whatnot came from. It, the extent that it's available would be helpful as we deliberate next time.
Would you like to call the roll?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
The second motion I'd like to make today does pertain specifically to 83105. Commissioner Hatch raised, I think, a significant point that this statute, as we have been interpreting it previously, and this is it's reflected in Chapter 4, Section 5, political activities, does arguably infringe on commissioners' First Amendment rights to contribute to federal candidates. I think that's a significant concern. As I sit here now, having reviewed 83105, I think it can be read to prohibit that type of contribution. I think it can be. But I also think there's enough in there where it is susceptible of a different interpretation. And I think in light of that, I would suggest that we seek an outside opinion as to Government Code 83105, perhaps from the Attorney General's office, to specifically ask them whether or not Government Code Section 83105 requires FPPC commissioners to abstain from contributing to federal candidates during their 4-year term. Once we have that opinion, I think we can then properly evaluate whether this policy is something that one, that we're stuck with, that we have to abide by, and then 2, if it is not, whether it's something that in any event we wish to impose upon ourselves. But I think at this point, given the concerns raised by Commissioner Hatch, I would move that we hold this policy in abeyance pending the Attorney General's opinion and further action by the Commission. Does that make sense in terms of a motion? So seek an AG opinion, and in the interim, we will hold this particular aspect of Chapter 4 in abeyance.
Clarification, Mr. Chair, if I might. 83105 is a specific section of the chapter 3, dealing with the commission itself. Might I suggest that the reference be to whether Chapter 3 requires that type of adherence? 83105, the version I'm looking at, refers specifically to removal of commissioners. There are other sections of Chapter 3 which may or may not impinge upon the issue that we're talking about here.
Right, so to be clear, my motion is specific as to whether or not 83105 prohibits commissioners from making contributions to federal candidates. That's the only aspect of 83105 that I'd want advice on from the Attorney General, and that particular prohibition, I think, is in Section 5 of Chapter 4. You're right, Chapter 3 references it at the beginning for the ban on holding office, participating in elections, lobbying, et cetera. But there's just a very specific question about 83105 that I was hoping we could get guidance on.
Yes, I see that. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. All right, do I have a second?
Second. And a question on the motion. So when you say held in abeyance, you're not talking about the change held in abeyance, but you're talking about that rule that exists now.
Yeah, put differently, I would suspend the operation of this existing policy that cites 83105 as a basis for prohibiting commissioners from contributing to federal candidates.
Thank you.
Until we have further clarification.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
I can't give any way. Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. And thank you to the other commissioners. I look forward to continuing our discussion on this as we move forward. Speaking of moving forward, we will now move to the next item on our agenda, item 24. These are our committee updates. I don't think we had budget and policy and law and policy this past month, though, so no update?
Nope.
All right. Moving to item 25 then, unregistered lobbying regulations.
Great.
This is an item that I asked be added to the agenda this month. My understanding from speaking with enforcement staff and folks in legal is that there is a gap currently in our regulations and in the law with respect to having effective means of identifying unregistered lobbyists. A lot of folks who lobby, I know Commissioner Hatch spent 40 years as a lobbyist and registered, played by the rules, but there are a lot of folks that aren't doing that. And so we need to explore whether we need additional tools to allow enforcement to identify those bad actors. So the purpose of this item would be to ask the commission to authorize the Law and Policy Committee to work with legal staff and enforcement to develop a regulation, or perhaps more than one regulation, to address that issue of unregistered lobbying. So that is the purpose. On a General Counsel Bainbridge, if you have additional commentary.
Would it also include potential legislative changes, or just be focused on regulatory?
You know, I would say this. I think in my own estimation, I think if you, through the work with your staff and Commissioner Hatch and through the committee, we identify areas where we need additional legislative authority, then absolutely. But I think ideally we would be able to do some things more quickly through the regulatory process, and then longer term, if we need additional statutory authority, we can deal with that then. Commissioner, comments on this?
I think that's a great idea. I know there have been a couple of matters since I've been here that just, I'm sure the tip of the iceberg. And so I think this is a great idea.
If I could, Mr. Chair, thank you for your confidence in me. I would say that this has been a long abused provision. And it's so pervasive that people have sort of come to the conclusion that it must be all right because nobody's getting in trouble for it. So some work really needs to be done in this area.
Is there any public comment on item 25? Seeing none. Do we have a motion?
I move for adoption of the recommendation.
Second?
Commissioner Carnes?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Excellent. All right, moving on to the legislative update. Mr. Ung, the table is yours.
Thank you, Chair Matich. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm a little sad that the crowd cleared before the most riveting part of the agenda, but that's okay. Just excuse me, I'm fighting a little bit of a cold, so if I sound congested, that is the reason why. Part of the updated legislative report that went on September 17th, as you know, the legislature has ended its first year of its two-year session. There are 8 bills that are on its way to the governor's desk, if not already on his desk. Not much to go over on most of the bills. We're sponsors of 2 of them, and we support another 4. There are 2, if I'm doing the math right on that, yes. There are 2 where we have a support if amended position. That would be Assembly Bill 201, which deals with text messages and disclaim. Absolutely.
Excuse me, if I could just interrupt you for a moment. Could you give us an overview on what you believe to be the standing authorization with reference to, for instance, bills that we've supported and or sponsored? It's been a long time since we sponsored any bills, as to what your franchise is in terms of communicating with the governor's office. We are a state agency, so therefore we are, I think, required to do enrolled bill reports, correct?
We are not. We don't
We're
do.
not, okay.
We don't do enrolled bill reports because although we're part of the executive branch, we're an independent agency within the executive branch, so we don't want to follow the same process.
Kind of like CalPERS is also independent that way. So on what has the longstanding practice been with respect to support or sponsored bills? You automatically would be expected to write a letter to the governor making a recommendation.
That is correct. When the bills were passed out of the legislature, we updated the letters that we had been using to communicate with the legislature and changed who it was addressed to and some of the advocacy language and changed the language to say that we're requesting that the governor sign the bill.
Okay, thank you.
To continue on, the 2 bills that have support of amended positions are Assembly Bill 201, which deals with text message disclaimers in campaigns, and Senate Bill 71, which deals with use of campaign funds to pay for legal claims. As we usually do at the end of session, under the Brown administration, we usually meet with the governor's legislative staff. Under the Newsom administration, they have continued that tradition, so we did meet with them earlier this week. They have informed us that they appreciated the briefing from the staff. However, the support of amended positions aren't ultimately helpful to their office, partly because it's too late to amend any bills at this point. One of their requests, and they did so very respectfully, they weren't directing us to do this. One of their requests is that that the commission may wish to evaluate its position of support if amended and give a more direct communication to the governor about whether he should sign, veto, or if we are truly neutral and agnostic on Assembly Bill 201 and Senate Bill 71. And so as part of the presentation, I do want to inform you that both of those bills were amended after the August meeting. AB 201, the text message bill, was amended. They did not take any of the amendments that we had requested. They did add further formatting requirements for how to use with, and they added a little bit more to the provision that deals with volunteers who use mass distribution technology. For volunteers who use mass distribution technology, they must include that they are a volunteer with the campaign, a phrase that says they're a volunteer with the campaign. For Senate Bill 71, they narrowed some of the language to the personnel who could benefit from these types of campaign funds. And I'll just read it to you now. The current bill says that campaign funds may be paid or reimburse a candidate or elected officer for a penalty or judgment or settlement. And under those specified requirements, prior to the amendments after the commission meeting, it was the candidate, elected officer, individual with authority to approve expenditure of campaign funds, employee, staff of the committee, or elected officers, governmental agency, or any other person. And so they narrowed it just to candidate and elected officer. And there were some joinder amendments that were added to both bills as well. And so at this point, I would turn it over to you and see how you would like us and what message you would like us to communicate to the governor's office in relation to AB 201 and Senate Bill 71. I believe there is a member of Ms. Cervantes' staff, the author of AB 201, who's in the audience, who may be able to provide public comment if we need it.
Were they planning to be present, or?
They're here currently.
Oh, okay, sure. I would just sort of preface that discussion with, now that the writing portion is finished, it's incumbent on us to do just as any other interest group would do, is look at what's on the governor's desk and say, are we better off with nothing, or are we better off with whatever it remains in each of these bills? And that's the test we should be applying. And that's a hold on the merits of them until after we hear from the public.
Do we have other commissioner comments at this point? All right, then perhaps we can hear from Assemblymember Cervantes' office.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, my name is Paco Torres. I'm the Legislative Director for Assemblymember Sabrina Cervantes. I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to speak. While I'm here, I also wanted to thank your staff for their work with us over the year on this bill. In particular, I want to recognize Councilors Bainbridge and Harrison for working with us, as well as Mr. Ung, who I hope to be able to call Councilor soon, in a month. But I wanted to avail myself as a resource in case you had any questions about the bill. I'm obviously happy to report that the bill was approved by both houses of the legislature with strong bipartisan support. We were happy to work with the commission on many of the amendments you suggested throughout the year. We were in the course of working with your staff to be responsive to some of the amendments that you suggested at the last commission meeting. However, at that point, we were drawn into negotiations with legislative leadership of both houses and our opposition. And the product that you see before you is the product of those negotiations, which I would call a compromise. As you know, with legislation, so often, not everyone gets what they want. And I think this bill in particular is an exercise in not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think Commissioner Hatch is completely correct. According to my own analysis and the analysis of the elections committees in both houses, in each house, if this bill is not enacted, then there will be no regulation of campaign text messages beginning on January 1, when we have a hotly contested election year ahead of us next year. So obviously, we would ask for your support of this bill, and we look forward to working with you in the future. And again, I want to avail myself as a resource if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Just a question. Sure. Was not your member a victim of mass texting?
Yes, as way of describing, of course, purely describing facts. 10 days out from her own campaign in 2018, a text message was sent to Latino voters in her district that targeted her on her vote for SB 1 from last session. Because of existing laws, there were no regulations requiring that the disclosure, that there was a paid for disclosure. To this day, nearly a year later, we still don't know who paid for those text messages. And obviously, the impetus of this bill is to prevent what happened to Assemblymember Cervantes to happen to candidates and members of the legislature or local elected offices across the state. I think the the principle embodied in the Disclose Act that the Disclose Acts rather, that the legislature has passed over the last few years is that the voters should know who is paying for campaign material that come across them, right? So at the very least, they can know what the source is. Unfortunately, due to the passage of AB 2188 last session, the existing regulations of text messages, as limited as they are right now, will expire. So we put forth this bill as a means to remedy that problem and to ensure that going forward, not only do we continue to have text message regulations, but that they continue to be expanded not only to as under current law, to independent expenditures and to ballot measures, but make sure that they also apply to candidates and to political parties as well. To be blunt, there's a loophole that exists right now. The loophole is going to get bigger on January 1st, and it will continue to persist unless we close it with the enactment of Assembly Bill 201. And again, I am happy to say that a majority of my Assembly members, my boss's colleagues in both houses agreed with that, and that's why you see the strong bipartisan vote on the floors of both houses of the legislature.
And to follow up, if this bill were vetoed, does it mean we could have a repeat of what happened?
Yes. And not only that, Commissioner Hatch, I agree with your point. It may be even worse, just because obviously I think campaign messages as a medium are growing in their usage. They have read rates upwards of 90%. So that is much higher than many other forms of campaign media, mail, television, radio included. And I think as the practitioners of campaigns realize their effectiveness, at least in communicating a political message to the voters, we are only going to see their usage in campaigns grow in the coming years. So that's why we think this is the appropriate time to provide regulations of those now, while this is a burgeoning field, and to prevent further, frankly, abuse. Because I think it's a precept of the laws that the legislature has passed to say people should know who paid for campaign material. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have additional public comment on this matter? Hearing none. Do we have a motion?
If I could, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move that we communicate with the governor's office our support for his signing this bill.
Are we, Commissioner Hatch, is your intent to take 201 and SB 71 separately, or are you?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. With respect to Assembly Bill 201, which is before us, I would ask that the commission recommend that the governor sign that bill.
All right, I'll second.
Commissioner Carnes?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right, so then with respect to SB 71, we're essentially being asked the same thing. What is our current position in light of the fact that we asked for, I think, pretty extensive amendments to SB 71? Those amendments were not made, and our position is support if amended. That bill in particular was one that we asked the senator to carry. That was something that we felt strongly about after we rescinded the Mendoza advice letter. I continue to have serious reservations about the current form of the bill, but personally, I think something is better than nothing in this area, and if this is where we have to start, then so be it. So I think we should continue urging the governor to support and sign SB 71. What do other commissioners think?
Well, I've been back and forth on this because my inclination is also that, we've got an interstitial space here with no law. And some guidance is better than nothing. Some limits are better than nothing. On the other hand, the last thing we've done in this area is rescind the Mendoza advice letter. That could send a signal to people who might otherwise feel free to use campaign money in harassment and discrimination contexts where we really would prefer they not. So I think I'm more in favor of opposing it. I feel supporting it, I think, sends a message of sort of acquiescence. I'd prefer not to do that. I'm not sure the author was entirely thrilled with how the amended bill came out either. And so there's sort of a situation there where, I would hate to burn a bridge with an ally, but I'm not sure coming out opposed to SB 71 would. Yeah, I'm actually thinking that maybe the status quo encourages more discipline on the part of people who would be misusing this money than sending a signal that some uses are compatible with the law when I don't think they are.
Other commissioner comments?
Yeah, actually, I remember when it first happened that this bill got sort of taken apart. I was pretty hot, and I was, resentful. But as time goes by, you begin to lose those things and be a little bit more open-minded on it. And I was particularly frustrated with the legislature's decision to drop the discrimination and just deal with the one that they thought that they had to deal with. And so part of me was like, well, maybe we should just go wait till next year. But the truth of the matter is, we have an author who is probably just as frustrated as we were at the events. This is not the author turning on us. This was, bigger than him. And so practical side to me says, would we be better off without this law? And I'd have to say, with respect to sexual harassment at least, this may provide an additional bit of protection. It's not perfect, and I certainly would want to go back and sponsor a bill to pursue what we didn't get last year, or this year, I should say. So I would lean towards recommending a signature.
Commissioner Cardenas, any comments? I guess the one comment I would make in response to what Commissioner Hayward raised is I don't see this as the end point. I see this as a potential starting point, legislatively at least. But no matter what happens legislatively, whether that's as far as the legislature is willing to go for several years, we continue to have regulatory authority in this area. And so even with if SB 71 were to be signed, we can continue to regulate in this area. So I guess I'm hopeful that we can continue doing what we can do in this area, even while the legislature struggles with this. Do we have any public comment on SB 71 then? Seeing none. All right, I would move that the commission submit a communication to the governor's office urging his signature on SB 71 then.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Sadly, no.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Owen.
You're welcome.
All right, moving to the advice letter report. General Counsel Bainbridge and Assistant General Counsel Lau. Anything in particular you would like to draw our attention to in the advice letter packet?
Oh, boy.
I'm here to offer any help if anybody has any questions.
All right. Commissioners, do we have any questions or comments on the advice letters?
Yeah, I did actually. Can't find them. Okay, here we go. There's a second page. All right. Just a passing comment on the first two letters. The Norton and Shergill. I didn't envy you on those because they were really close to the edge. It's a tough one to have to do. And I'm not saying you got it right or wrong. I just observed that the line was very close. As to the Carroll, As the Carroll letter, as well as I think there were some others that I didn't write down. This reference to legally required participation exception, I was wondering, I'm not asking you to change the advice. I just would like you to maybe give me a better understanding of how that is applied and who does this apply to, just local government or state agencies as well? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's William M. Carroll, A 19067. And it invokes what they call a legally required participation exception.
Okay, and what was your question regarding that?
Well, it was just, if you could kind of like, who does this apply to? Is it just local government, or is it also the state? And what, kind of walk us through how that works.
Okay, it is a regulatory provision, and what it allows for is any time that a quorum cannot be established because there are too many officials that are disqualified from the decision, that the agency can move forward with the decision by selecting an official to participate by randomly selecting an official to participate with the decision so that a quorum can be established. So it does apply to any agency, and it making a decision, but it's limited only to those instances where a quorum cannot be established because too many officials are disqualified.
Right, so state and local. So
State
like
and local, correct.
PUC or
Yes.
city council. Okay, and then I guess I missed the part until you just said it about that it's to be a random selection if you're short, right?
Correct.
Okay. And it, does it, assuming that you have a majority that are conflicted and you bring it back to a quorum level, you by random, you pick and you get one or two, as the case may be, people back on so that you can conduct business on it, does it require that, in that case, that they be a unanimous approval, one direction or the other? Or is it
It would still be majority
quorum?
vote. It would still go by whatever the body's rules are, but it's normally majority vote.
Majority of the quorum?
Right.
Okay. But it could be statutorily majority of the entire board.
If they had some other supermajority requirements, that particular body, they may be, but it would normally just fall back to the majority of the people that were participating in the vote is the standard.
Well, like I know on certain, like on a regulatory matter, this commission is required to have a majority of the entire commission, even if you have a permanent absence or semi-permanent absence. But other matters that we do, it's a majority of the quorum, correct? Yeah.
Right.
Okay, thank you. The Shelley Whitaker, so I guess number 132,
Okay.
the last three digits. I surmised that this ban would apply as soon as they stopped working, even though they might be on the payroll, is the term they use, of running off time. But then there was something, and I think was the first, the very beginning of the answer, there was something that would, maybe it's just the way, lateness of the hour when I was reading it, that it seemed like to contradict itself. And so I was just wanting for clarification, does this ban apply at the beginning, right as soon as they start their runoff, or is there a gap and they doesn't till they actually are gone for good?
You are correct in the reading that it applies as soon as they physically stop working for the agency.
Okay, thank you.
The runoff period doesn't count.
Okay. And then one last one, Veronica Nebb, it's number 127. I got that out of order. And I guess my comment on that is from the facts that were provided by the seeker of the advice seemed awful strong smell of straw man there. And I guess, I know you've covered yourself in the advice indicating that if they were a straw man, that, this doesn't apply. And I guess that's about all you can do, but it sure looked kind of.
We drafted as strong of a warning as as we thought we could.
Yeah, thank you. That's it, thank you.
Any other commissioners?
I have a quick one. The Sutton letter, I-19-165. Just because it's bringing back before us that standard thing about 5% of what? Sort of an existential question. Does total height mean total height per line or total height of the whole disclosure? And I know this is informal advice. I still think this is kind of a, their reasonable minds are disagreeing, continue to disagree on what total means. Or what, total height means. Was this in a reg proposal, or was this something, because I can't remember the recent history of this. I know that the people, members of the public have been here to talk to us about it. Where are we? Are we working on a reg? Is this just another shot over the bow?
The legislation is on the governor's desk, and the author's office has confirmed that their intention was 5% per line.
Right.
And the new draft of the legislation on the governor's desk clearly states that.
Thank you. That reminds me, because I think the way it's written, reasonable minds could differ, and I also agree with staff, though, that that's kind of a strange result. So, okay, thank you.
Any other commissioner comments on the advice letter report? Seeing none. All right, thank you guys very much. All right, moving on to item 28. This is a proposal to create a task force to study best practices for regulating campaign activity on digital media and through social media. And so the idea here would be that we have some gaps regulatory-wise, statutorily in some ways as well, with respect to regulating campaign activity that's occurring on these digital platforms. The Campaign Center, the Brennan Center, other organizations have highlighted the need for additional regulation in this area. So the purpose of this task force would be to study and recommend to us what the best practices are for regulating in this area, and working with our staff, develop sort of what are we doing currently and what more can we be doing, if anything, to get our arms around this. So I would like the commission to approve the creation of this task force. And as part of that, I would ask that Commissioner Hayward work with me on that task force and sit on that task force with me.
Happy to do it.
Great.
So moved.
Second.
All right, is there any public comment on item 28? Seeing none, hearing none. All right, please call the roll.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Manich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Great. All right, moving on to item 29 then, executive staff reports. Let's begin with the Enforcement Division report. Chief of Enforcement West, welcome back to the table. Do any commissioners have any questions for the Chief of Enforcement?
Actually, I did have one I asked in the hallway, and I think it's good to get it out there so that people know. We had did a lot of work, and Galena especially was taxed on this to develop an expansion of the Streamline program, and it seems to be working very well. But the question I had in my mind, and it was a procedural one, and that wasn't clear to me, and I noticed that some of the streamlines were from clients who were represented by attorneys, and streamline process seemed fairly simplistic to me. So I had asked, at what point do the people charged know that they're eligible, and how they become to know, or is it something they have to ask their lawyer or whatnot? And she gave me a satisfactory answer. I'd just like her to be able to sort of summarize what she said.
Certainly. Galena West, Chief of Enforcement. The majority of streamlined cases are handled by either referral or complaint, where then we send out what we call a 30-day demand letter, to where we say, hey, you know, it looks like you may have not done this or complied with this. Comply, and you could be eligible for our streamlined program, which has lower fines, and here's a contact person that you can get a hold of. There are a few cases that come in more as complaints that we have to figure out what they're about, and then they get contacted about streamline later on. But the majority are from asking for compliance and letting them know about the program.
And those other ones where it comes from a complaint, how would they, or at what point would they be brought to know that they're eligible for the streamlined process?
Once we figure out, gather more information to figure out what's going on, and then contact them and see if they can come into compliance, we let them know about the program.
Okay.
And then see if they would like to cooperate. And
So it's not something like a secret handshake thing? They have to
No.
know somebody to know?
No,
Thank you, I appreciate it.
every case gets evaluated.
That
for
everybody will
streamline.
know that it's there, and they should just take advantage of it if they can.
Much to the chagrin of some of the attorneys that would prefer to write paragraphs instead of check boxes, every case gets evaluated for streamline.
Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Any other questions for Chief of Enforcement West? All right, thank you very much. Legal Division Report, General Counsel Bainbridge.
As submitted.
All right, any questions for General Counsel Bainbridge?
Haven't I asked them all?
No.
Good now.
All right, very much. All right, our Administration and Technology Division Report, Chief of Admin Han. Any questions for Ms. Han? All right, and last but not least, Executive Staff Report, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just by way of update, we continue to roll out the process of entering into contracts with localities to take over their enforcement of their ethics and campaign rules. That's going at pace. I expected and was not disappointed to find out that there's a process that each locality has to go through. So a lot of them are coming up to votes this month as to whether they want to enter into contracts with us. I will keep you apprised. There are a couple of IP meetings. I believe Enforcement Officer West noted one of them, I think, but there's two over the next month. One has to do with fixes to the Disclose Act. The other has to do with technical changes upcoming, so we will be hosting those. There is another meeting with the Secretary of State with respect to the CARS rollout that is rolling slowly but apace so far. The last thing that I wanted to note is I am planning on having at the November meeting a brief celebration of the 45th anniversary of the PRA. That I'll have more about that at next month's meeting, but that will be sort of a pre-meeting get-together that I'm hoping to have. And I'll take any questions if you have them.
Actually, I do have a question. That's on the budget. It's that time of year in the budget process to be preparing for submissions to finance on what out of the ordinary that we need to deal with. And I know we've got legislation that's potentially affecting us currently, but also this past legislation, in particular, one that's relative to assigning the duty to write advice on the, oh boy, now I'm going to have a senior moment, the, shit. 1090, thank you. Section 1090 letters, yeah.
1090.
Yeah. Did that come out of my head or was that out of your mouth? So I noticed that they're steadily taking a larger section of the time on the advice letter agenda. And I think if you haven't already considered it, it would be a good idea, in my view, to prepare a budget change proposal on the issue of 1090 letters. It's kind of snuck up on us. It was certainly imposed on us before you ever came around, and even before I came around. So, but that doesn't mean we can't ask for that to be recognized.
I will definitely meet with Chief of Admin Hahn on that issue. I have, as I've shared with you, similar concerns going forward over the next 6 months about budget.
Okay,
So we'll
great. Thank you.
investigate that.
Additional questions for Executive Director Jones? All right. The only thing I would mention, we both were able to attend a forum on Monday, the California Leads Forum. I think it was great information. The governor's office put together, had all the department heads and executive directors attend, as well as some of our senior staff. One of the focuses, there were several focuses, but one focus was identifying and eliminating implicit bias within our state agencies. And I know I talked to you about this. I would encourage you to try and identify programs that we can roll down to staff in our agency to also get the benefit of those trainings. Because I think some of the information they gave us was really very good. So I hope in the future we're able to roll that out.
Along those lines, I will tell the commission, one of the presentations to which the chair is referring was by Reverend Dr. Marks. His first name was Bryant Marks. Excellent presentation. He had worked with the Obama administration on implicit bias. I reached out to Dr. Marks yesterday by email to sort of probe what the costs were. They are going to be doing a variety of trainings for California state agencies in 2020. So I asked for a cost estimate. I think it'll be an excellent program, not just for our office, but maybe even some of our stakeholders.
That'd be great. And that may actually be something we may need budget augmentation for, it sounds like.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
along those lines.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we already reported on closed session. Item 31, do commissioners have any comments or proposed future agenda items?
When is the October meeting? That's on a Friday, is that right?
Correct.
Third Friday, still? Third week?
Third Friday. Somebody tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong. Excellent.
18th.
I'm sorry?
October 18th.
18th, okay.
All right. Hearing no other comments, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.